I want you to think about how much money your startup is spending on HR tools right now. If you're like most of the companies I work with, you either have no idea or the number is going to make you uncomfortable for the wrong reasons. You're either spending too much on tools you barely use, or you're spending almost nothing and manually doing work that should have been automated 6 months ago. A 2024 Gartner survey found that only 24% of HR functions are actually maximizing the business value from their HR technology. So, three or four HR teams are paying for tools they are not getting their full value from. And 69% of employees have reported running into at least one barrier when trying to use their company's HR tech in the past 12 months. And on the other end, I talk to companies every week that are running payroll through a patchwork of spreadsheets and prayer, wondering why their HR person is buried under admin work and can never get to anything strategic. Today, I'm going to walk you through what I call the minimum viable HR tech stack. That is the exact approach I use with my clients to figure out which tools they actually need, when they need them, and where every dollar of their HR tech budget should go at each stage of growth. I'm going to break this down across four stages: under 50 employees, 50 to 150, 150 to 300, and then 300 to 500.
Right.
Hello and welcome to Organized Chaos. I'm your host, Naha Kirala, and for more than 15 years, I've been helping startups scale their people operations. And a huge part of that work comes down to building the right infrastructure at the right time. I have built HR tech stacks from scratch. I have torn apart bloated ones that were bleeding money, and I have seen firsthand what happens when companies get this decision wrong in either direction. Now, before we get into it, if you are listening to this and realizing your HR tech stack needs work, or you are not sure where to start, I offer HR sprints where I come in and help you evaluate, restructure, or build your stack from the ground up. You'll find the link in the show notes below. Now, let's get into it. First, I need to define what I mean by minimum viable HR tech stack because most people interpret it wrong. They hear minimum and think that means do as little as possible. That is not what this is. Minimum viable HR tech stack means you have the smallest set of tools and processes that keep you legally compliant, operationally functional, and positioned to scale without having to rip everything out and start over as you grow. Think of it like building a house. You do not need granite countertops when you are pouring the foundation, but you absolutely need the foundation to be solid because everything else is going to sit on top of it. The companies that get this wrong usually fall into one of two camps. The first camp spends almost nothing and does everything manually until something breaks, such as running into a compliance issue or a key employee walking out because the onboarding experience was pure chaos. The second camp goes out and buys state of the art and expensive tools on the market because someone at a Series C company recommended them. And then they wonder why they are paying $12,000 a year for features that are designed for a 500-person company when they only have 40 employees. Both approaches cost you more in the long run. The first one costs you in fire drills, legal exposure, and inefficiency. The second one costs you in wasted budget and tool fatigue, where your team stops using the systems because they are overkill for what you actually need. The goal is to match your HR infrastructure to your stage. What you need at 30 employees is fundamentally different from what you need at 200. And if you try to build for 200 when you are at 30, you're wasting money. If you're still operating like a 30-person company when you hit 200, you have a weak foundation that is going to break. So let me walk you through what you actually need when your company has fewer than 50 people. At this stage, your HR tech stack should be lean, affordable, and focused on three things: staying compliant, paying people correctly, and not losing critical information. First, you need payroll. This is non negotiable from day one, and this is not the place to cut corners, ever. Getting payroll wrong exposes you to tax penalties, employee lawsuits, and the kind of trust damage that you just cannot undo. I don't care if you have two employees. You need a proper system that handles tax withholdings, filings, and direct deposits. At this stage, something like Gusto is going to serve you well. It's affordable, it's intuitive, and it does the basics without overwhelming you with features you will not use for another 2 years. I've seen companies try to run payroll manually or through their accountant's software, and it almost always leads to tax filing errors that cost more to fix than the payroll tool would have cost in the first place. Second, you need a basic HRIS, which is your system of record for employee data. At this stage, this does not need to be a separate tool. Your payroll system can double as your HRIS. Gusto, for example, stores employee information, tracks PTO, and handles basic document storage. And if you are using a PEO like JustWorks, ADP, or similar, the HRS that comes bundled with their service is generally going to be good enough for this stage. You are already paying for it, so use it. You do not need a standalone HRIS until you are past the 25 to 30 employee mark. And even then, you may be able to push it further depending on your complexity. Buying one too early is just a waste of money. Third, you need an applicant tracking system. And I know what some of you might be thinking. We only hire a few people a year. We do not need an ATS. Yes, you do. Even if you're hiring infrequently, you need a central place to track candidates, store resumes, and document your hiring decisions. This is partly about efficiency, but it is also about compliance. If someone ever challenges a hiring decision, you need to be able to show your process. At this stage, something simple and free, or maybe low cost, works just fine. You do not need an enterprise recruiting platform. Fourth, you need a way to manage documents such as offer letters, NDAs, I-9s, tax forms, and employee handbooks. At this stage, a well organized Google Drive folder with a clear naming convention and an e signature tool is really sufficient. Save your money here. A Google Drive folder with a clear structure costs you nothing and works perfectly fine until you hit the stage where compliance requirements demand something more sophisticated. And fifth is workflow automation. I cannot stress this one enough. Even at this stage, tools like Zapier or Make will save your HR person hours every week. Automating things like onboarding checklists, PTO notifications, and new hire account creation costs very little, and it frees your team to focus on work that actually requires a human brain. That is your under 50 stack: payroll, basic employee record system, a simple ATS, organized document storage with e-signatures, and some lightweight automations. Total cost should be somewhere between $100 and $500 a month, depending on your choices. If you're spending significantly more than that at this stage, you are overbuilt. Now let's talk about what changes when you cross 50 employees and start heading towards 150. This is the stage where most companies realize their scrappy early setup is falling apart. Processes that worked when everyone sat in the same room and could tap someone on the shoulder with a question simply do not scale when you have 5 or 6 teams across multiple time zones. First, you absolutely need a standalone HRIS now. Your payroll system alone is not going to cut it because you need proper org chart management, more sophisticated PTO policies, performance tracking, and a self service portal where employees can update their own information and access company policies without pinging HR for every little thing. That self service piece alone is going to save your team an enormous amount of time. I have seen HR teams at companies this size spend 30 to 40% of their time answering routine questions that a self service system handles automatically. Tools like Bamboo HR or Rippling start to make sense at this stage. Rippling in particular is interesting because it combines HRIS, payroll, and IT management in one platform, which really reduces the number of systems you're juggling. I'm also watching a new wave of AI native HRIS platforms like Shapes and Leapsome that are building intelligence directly into the core system rather than just bolting it on as an afterthought. I've not implemented them with a client yet, so I'm not going to give you a full endorsement, but the approach is worth paying attention to, especially if you're a tech forward company and wants your HRS to do more than just store data. Second, your ATS needs to grow up. When you are hiring consistently, you need proper pipeline management. You need interview scorecards and scheduling automation. The lightweight tool you were using before 50 employees is going to create bottlenecks. So, investing in a more robust recruiting platform pays for itself in recruiter productivity and candidate experience. According to recent data, the cost of a bad hire ranges from 50 to 200% or more of that person's annual salary. And that's when you factor in things like lost productivity, replacement costs, and the disruption to your team. If a better ATS helps you make even a few smarter hiring decisions per year, it has already paid for itself. Greenhouse is the industry leader in this space for a reason. It has a mature feature set, strong integrations, and a structured hiring framework that helps companies build consistency into their process. It's a proven choice, especially if you want something battle tested at scale. Ashby is another one I have been watching closely. They've built an ATS that combines recruiting, analytics, and scheduling into a single platform. And from what I have seen, talking to their team and watching demos, they're particularly well suited for companies that want strong data and reporting baked into their hiring process from the start. I haven't deployed it yet with a client, but the companies I know who are using it have had good things to say. Third, you need a proper performance management system. At this stage, informal check ins and a Google Doc create massive inconsistency. Different managers are evaluating people against different standards. Feedback is happening sporadically, and you have no data to support compensation or promotion decisions. You need a system that standardizes your review cycles, captures feedback, and gives you actual data on how your people are performing. There are some good tools out there like Lattice and CultureAmp, but I have been keeping an eye on a tool called Opry. They are taking an AI native approach to performance management that focuses on continuous feedback and real time insights rather than the traditional annual review cycle. And the philosophy behind it aligns with how I believe performance management should operate at growing companies. It is still relatively new, so I would encourage you to do your own evaluation, but it is on my radar for a reason. Fourth, this is the stage where you should seriously consider a learning management system, especially if your business requires any kind of compliance training or if you're onboarding more than a few people per month. Before you invest in a full LMS, though, ask yourself whether a well-organized, Notion workspace or a series of Loom videos would accomplish the same thing. For many companies at the lower end of this range, the answer is yes. Move to a proper LMS when the volume of training content and the frequency of delivery genuinely justifies the cost. And fifth, you need to start building your analytics capability. At this stage, you should be tracking turnover rates, time to hire, offer acceptance rates, and compensation benchmarks, just to name a few examples. If you cannot pull these numbers quickly, you are making people decisions blind. Most of the tools I have mentioned have built in reporting. The key is making sure that someone on your team is actually using that information. The 50 to 150 tech stack is going to run you somewhere in the range of $2,000 to $5,000 a month, depending on your tool choices and whether you're running a domestic or international team. A study by SHRM puts the average cost per hire at $4,700. If your HR tech stack helps you avoid even 2 or 3 bad hires per year, the tools are already paid for themselves multiple times over. Now, when you cross the 150 employee mark, the game changes in a meaningful way. You're no longer a startup figuring things out. You are a scaling company, and your infrastructure needs to reflect that. The biggest shift at this stage is that your HR team is no longer just executing processes. They need to be making data driven strategic decisions, and your tools need to support that. First, your HRIS needs to be doing some serious work now. You need robust workflow automation built into the system itself, not just Zapier connections on top of it. I'm talking about automated approval chains for promotions, compensation changes, and role transitions. You need proper onboarding and offboarding workflows that touch every system in your stack automatically. If your HR team is still manually deactivating accounts or sending checklists when someone leaves, you have a problem that is only getting worse with every new hire. Second, you need a dedicated compensation management tool. At 50 employees, you could get away with a spreadsheet and some market data. At 150 to 300, that approach becomes quite dangerous. You need a system that helps you maintain pay bands, run compensation reviews, benchmark against the market, and identify pay equity issues before they turn into legal exposure or resignations. This is one of those areas where spending real money pays off. Pay equity is the number one money reason that people quit, and you can't manage what you can't see. Third, your analytics need to move beyond basic reporting. You need to be running things like engagement surveys, tracking sentiment trends over time, and connecting your people data to business outcomes. Turnover by department, performance by team, time to productivity for new hires. At this stage, your VP of people or your head of HR should be walking into leadership meetings with data. If your tools cannot produce that data without someone spending, 2 days pulling it together in Excel, you need better tools. Fourth, you probably need a proper learning and development platform now, not just for compliance training, but for manager development, leadership pipelines, and career pathing. At this stage, you likely have new managers who have never managed people before, and the cost of leaving them untrained shows up in your engagement scores and your turnover numbers. A good L&D platform lets you build development programs that will scale with your headcount instead of requiring your HR team to manually facilitate every session. And fifth, compliance automation becomes critical at this stage. Depending on your industry and the states or countries you operate in, you are now dealing with a more complex web of regulatory requirements. Tools that automate compliance tracking and manage required training certifications and can probably even flag upcoming deadlines, those will save you from the kind of mistakes that come with real financial penalties. Now, at 300 to 500 employees, you are operating at a level where your HR stack is no longer just supporting the business. It has become a strategic system that directly impacts your ability to execute. The decisions you make about tools at this stage have downstream effects on everything from how fast you can hire to how well you retain your best people. First, if you have not already consolidated into a full human capital management platform, this is the stage where it becomes almost unavoidable. You need a unified system that connects HRIS, payroll, benefits administration, time tracking, and workforce management in one place. Running 5 or 6 different point solutions that each handle one piece of the puzzle just creates too much operational risk at this size. When you have 300 people, a missed integration or a broken sync between your systems becomes a compliance risk and a data integrity problem. Second, workforce planning becomes a standalone function that needs its own tooling. You're now making decisions about headcount budgets, org design, and capacity planning that directly affect your burn rate and your ability to hit revenue targets. You need tools that let you model scenarios, track headcount against your plan in real time, and flag when departments are drifting from their approved hiring budgets. This isn't something you can do in a spreadsheet anymore without creating serious risk of error. And third, your recruitment operation at this size likely has a dedicated team, and that team needs enterprise grade tools. Your ATS should be handling high volume pipeline management, automating sourcing workflows, offer approval chains, and deep analytics on every stage of your funnel. You should know exactly where candidates are dropping off, which hiring managers are slow to provide feedback, and what your cost per hire looks like by department and role level. At this stage, you're competing for talent against companies that have this infrastructure. So you cannot afford to be slower or less coordinated than they are. Fourth, succession planning and talent management need dedicated tooling. At 300 plus employees, you have enough organizational depth that losing a key leader without a plan creates real disruption. You need to identify high potential employees. You need to build development plans and track their readiness for critical roles. This is where the AI native tools I mentioned earlier start to show their real value because the volume of data you're working with at this stage is large enough that manual review becomes impractical. And fifth, your entire stack needs a security and compliance layer that matches the scale of your data. You're holding sensitive personal information for hundreds of people, and you need proper access controls, audit trails, and data retention policies across every system. If you're operating internationally, then you're dealing with GDPR, local labor laws, and cross border data transfer requirements. This is an area where most companies underinvest until something goes wrong. And by then, the cost of fixing it is significantly higher than the cost of building it right in the first place. Now, before I wrap up the HR tech stack breakdown, I want to call out a few categories of tools that deliver outsized value relative to what they cost, regardless of which stage you're at. Workflow automation is at the top of that list. I saw this firsthand with a retail client I worked with. When I came in, they had the highest tier of subscriptions for several HR tools, and they were so underutilized that the company was still doing some things manually despite paying for the automation. They were spending more money for worse outcomes. So I revamped their tech stack, which led to more than 40% in cost reduction. And then I implemented automations using Zapier that reduced the HR team's response times by more than 70%. They went from a very bloated, expensive, and underperforming stack to a lean one that actually worked. The total monthly cost went down and the output went up. That is what happens when you focus on utilization rather than features. E-signature tools are another one. I know this sounds very basic, but you won't believe the amount of companies that I see that are still scanning, printing, and chasing down signatures for things like policy acknowledgments, offer letters, contract amendments, and so forth. It's really absurd. A good e-signature tool costs almost nothing relative to the time it saves. Get one on day one and never look back. Now, most HRIS tools today have some kind of e-signature built in, so there's no excuse for not having one. Now, let me walk you through the mistakes I see over and over because they're almost always preventable. The first mistake is buying tools before you have defined your processes. A tool does not fix the broken process, it just makes a broken process happen faster. The tool should automate and scale a process that already works. If you skip the process design and go straight to the tool, you will end up with expensive software that nobody uses correctly because nobody agreed on how it should be used in the first place. The second mistake is tool sprawl. This is when you end up with 7 or 8 different tools that each handle one small piece of the HR puzzle, and none of them talk to each other or talk to each other at the extent you actually need. Every time an employee starts, someone has to manually enter their information into 5 different systems. The retail company I mentioned had exactly this problem. They had subscriptions for tools with overlapping functionality, and the HR team was spending more time managing the tools than actually doing their work. Consolidation was one of the first things I addressed. The third mistake is ignoring integrations. Can your ATS push new hire data into your HRIS? Can your HRIS sync with your payroll? If these systems do not talk to each other, you're creating manual work that scales linearly with your headcount. At 30 employees, manual data entry between systems is annoying, but once you get to 200, it's really a full time job. The fourth mistake is not measuring utilization. If you're paying for a performance management tool and only 40% of your managers are completing reviews in the system, then you have an adoption problem. This is not a tech problem. Companies with structured change management see 85 to 90% adoption rates compared to 60 to 65% for those without one. That gap is entirely about how you roll out and reinforce the tool, not the tool itself. And the fifth mistake is building for the company you want to be instead of the company you are. I understand the appeal of future proofing, and you should factor in some of it, especially if you're scaling pretty quickly. But I have watched companies spend $50,000 a year on an HR tech stack built for a 500-person company when they had 50 employees with no clear timeline for getting to that size. Build for your current stage and trust that a well chosen stack can grow with you. So, let me tell you more about what happens when you actually get this right. I built the entire HR tech stack for a health tech startup from scratch. We chose every tool based on what the company actually needed at that stage, not what looked impressive on a vendor demo. We integrated the systems properly, we automated every manual process we could find, and we trained the team to actually use what we built. In 12 months, that stack saved the company more than $1 million in recruiting spend, and it reduced their overall HR department's operating spend by 35%. That's because we bought the right tools, built on top of the right processes, integrated them correctly, and made sure people used them with proper change management. So let me bring all this together now. Your HR tech stack should match your stage. Under 50 employees, keep it lean with payroll, basic system of record, a simple ATS, and organized document storage. At 50 to 150, invest in a standalone HRIS, a robust ATS, performance management, and start building your analytics muscle. At 150 to 300, you need compensation management, engagement tools, a real L&D platform, and compliance automation. Once you get to 300 to 500, consolidate into a full HCM platform. Add workforce planning, succession management, and enterprise-grade security. But at every stage, Invest in automation and integration because those are what turn a collection of tools into an actual system. Define your processes before you buy the tools. Measure utilization after you deploy them, and resist the urge to overbuild for a stage you have not reached yet. If you're looking at your current tech stack and realizing it needs work, or if you're building one from scratch and want to get it right the first time, check out my HR sprints at the Organized Chaos website. I've included a link in the show notes below. And that's it for this episode. If you found this valuable, share it with someone who is either drowning in tools or has none at all. I'll see you on the next one.